You'll birth me 5 sons by spring with that body. That's what a prince shouted in the dusty village square, turning a poor peasant girl into the cruelest joke of the kingdom. But the girl he mocked did not break. With quiet courage she answered him back, and in that moment, something stirred in the heart of the very man who shamed her. Dragged from her cottage to the palace kitchens, she faces long nights by candlelight, whispers of scandal in the halls, and the icy scorn of nobles who want her gone. Yet every stolen glance from the prince pulls her deeper into danger, because this is no ordinary jest. Her family's lost bloodline hides a truth that could shake the throne itself. As whispers turn to fury and a forced betrothal threatens to tear them apart, one question thunders louder than the church bells at midnight. Will love born from humiliation destroy them both, or redeem them before the crown? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Agnes wrung out another piece of wet laundry. Her strong hands worked the fabric against the washboard, the cool water from the stone well splashing against her worn apron. Behind her, she could hear the whispers and snickers of the village women who gathered to draw their daily water. "Poor thing, so stout for her age," one woman murmured, not bothering to lower her voice. Her mother's death left her to feed those 5 little ones, but she seems to keep most of the bread for herself. Agnes pressed her lips together, focusing on the steady rhythm of her work. The harsh lye soap stung her raw fingers, but she welcomed the familiar discomfort. It helped her ignore the cruel words that followed her like shadows. Her youngest brother, Thomas, played near her feet with a carved wooden horse, their father's last gift before the fever took him too. The other children were scattered about the village, doing what odd jobs they could to help keep food on their table. "At least she has some use," another woman said. "Strong as an ox, that one. Better suited to farm work than finding a husband." Suddenly, a trumpet blast cut through the morning air. The village erupted into excitement as the royal herald's cry rang out. "Make way for His Royal Highness, Prince Edmund." Agnes quickly gathered Thomas into her arms, stepping back from the well as villagers poured into the square. The thunder of hooves grew louder, and the royal procession appeared around the bend. Guards in polished armor flanked a magnificent white stallion upon which sat Prince Edmund himself. The prince sat tall in his saddle, his velvet doublet catching the morning light. His golden hair and proud bearing marked him as royal even without his fine clothes. The villagers bowed low, their cheers echoing off the timber-framed houses. Agnes dipped into a curtsy, holding Thomas close. She kept her eyes downcast, as was proper, but she could feel the weight of stares upon her. The procession had nearly passed when the prince's horse suddenly halted before her. "You there!" Prince Edmund's voice rang out, silencing the crowd. Agnes raised her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs as she met his gaze. His handsome face wore an expression of amused disdain as he looked down at her. "With that body, you'll birth me 5 sons by spring," he declared with a laugh. The courtiers around him burst into elegant titters, their silk sleeves hiding painted smirks. The village folk joined in more heartily, their laughter sharp and cruel. Agnes felt her face burn red as fire, but she held her curtsy, clutching Thomas tighter as he buried his face in her neck. "God give you good day, Your Highness," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The prince's eyes widened slightly at her dignity, but he quickly turned away, spurring his horse forward as the procession continued. The laughter lingered long after the royal party had gone. Agnes returned to her washing, ignoring the fresh round of gossip his words had inspired. She worked until her arms ached, and the sun began to sink toward the western hills dot as dusk settled over the village. Agnes sat in her family's small cottage, stirring the meager pot of soup that would feed her siblings. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light on the worn floorboards, and the sleeping children huddled on their shared pallet. Outside, she could hear village boys passing by, their voices raised in mockery. 5 sons by spring, they called out, laughing. Better start sewing the swaddling clothes, Agnes. Agnes closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. The Lord is my shepherd, she whispered, her mother's worn Bible open in her lap. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. The boys' taunts grew louder, cool declarations of the prince's jest echoing through the growing darkness. But Agnes continued her quiet recitation, letting the familiar words wash over her like a healing balm. Her fingers traced the well-worn pages, finding comfort in the promises contained therein. He leadeth me beside the still waters, she murmured, watching the flames dance in the hearth. He restoreth my soul, though tears pricked at her eyes. She refused to let them fall. Her dignity might be all she had left of her gentle birth, but it was hers to keep. No prince's cruel jest could take that from her, no matter how the mockery might sting. The morning market bustled with activity as Agnes made her way through the crowded square, her warm basket clutched tightly in her hands. The events of yesterday still hung heavy in the air, carried on whispers and poorly hidden smirks from the villagers who parted before her like water. There she goes, a woman's voice carried clearly across the market. The prince's chosen one. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Agnes kept her head high, though her cheeks burned. She had precious few coins in her apron pocket, earned from weeks of mending clothes for the miller's wife. The butcher's stall ahead displayed meager cuts of meat, but even a small portion would make a hearty stew for her hungry siblings. Good. Morrow, Master Cooper, she said quietly, approaching the butcher's counter. Might I have a small cut of mutton today? The butcher, a heavy-set man with ruddy cheeks, looked her up and down with unconcealed mockery. Well, if it isn't our future royal mother. He made an exaggerated bow, drawing snickers from nearby customers. Shouldn't you be saving your coin for swaddling clothes? 5 sons by spring, wasn't it? Heat crept up Agnes's neck, but she stood straight and tall. I have got good coin to spend, sir, earned honest and true. Take your coin elsewhere, Cooper sneered, turning his back. I'll not serve those who above their station rise, thinking royal jests make them special. Agnes felt all eyes upon her, waiting to see her shame. But something stirred within her breast, not anger, but a quiet certainty born of faith. It is the Lord who grants life, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed market. Not prince's boasts. She turned away from the butcher's reddening face, clutching her empty basket. As she walked home, she held her tears, until she was safely behind the cottage door. Miles away, in the village's finest inn, Prince Edmund lounged at the head table, surrounded by his men. Candles flickered in iron sconces as servants hurried to keep their cups filled with rich red wine. The prince lifted his goblet, letting the firelight play through the dark liquid. Your Highness, one of his companions said, have you heard? That village girl from yesterday. She had words about you in the market today. Edmund's hand stilled, the wine untasted. Oh? He affected disinterest, though something tightened in his chest. Aye, she spoke of God's will over prince's boasts. The courtier laughed. Quite bold for a common maid. Edmund drained his cup in one long swallow, but he couldn't wash away the memory of those steady eyes that had met his gaze without flinching. Even in her humiliation, she had shown more grace than his cruel jest deserved dot as the evening wore. On, the prince grew quieter, his usual sharp wit dulled by wine and unwelcome thoughts. When he finally retired to his chamber, sleep proved elusive. In his dreams, Those quiet eyes haunted him. Not angry, not tearful, but filled with a dignity. That made his own behavior seem small and mean. He tossed and turned until dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and grays. Rising from his tangled sheets, Edmund moved to the window. Below, the village roof submerged from the morning mist like islands in a pale sea. Somewhere down there, she was likely already awake, tending to her family with that same quiet strength. He couldn't forget. Guilt sat heavy in his stomach, souring the wine from the night before. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, trying to push away thoughts of her. He was a prince. What did one village girl's opinion matter? He would forget her, must forget her. Yet something in her words had struck deeper than he cared to admit, binding him to the memory of that moment in ways he couldn't understand. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as Prince Edmund's procession made its way through the capital's grand gates. Inside the royal coach, he sat lost in thought while his attendants chattered about their journey home. The familiar sight of the palace's towering spires brought him no comfort. "Did you hear what they're saying in the servants' hall?" whispered one maid to another as they unpacked the prince's traveling trunks. "About His Highness and some village girl? I heard he promised to make her his bride." Another servant giggled, folding Edmund's cloaks. Edmund's jaw tightened as he passed by, pretending not to hear. These whispers had followed him all the way from that cursed hamlet. What had seemed a harmless jest now haunted his every step in the great hall. King Richard paced before his throne, his boots echoing against the marble floor. When Edmund entered and bowed, the king's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. "What is this nonsense I hear about you making promises to peasant girls?" the king demanded, his voice sharp enough to make the nearby courtiers flinch. "Have you lost all sense of propriety?" "Father, it was merely a jest," Edmund began, but the king cut him off with a wave of his hand. "A jest? The crown prince does not jest about marriage. You have made us look foolish." King Richard's face flushed with anger. "This ends now. You will wed by spring to a lady of noble blood and proper breeding." Queen Eleanor, who had been watching silently from her throne, stepped forward. Her silk skirts rustled softly as she touched her husband's arm. "Perhaps we should not be hasty, my love. Edmund is still young." "No." The king's fist crashed down on the arm of his throne. "I will hear no more excuses. The boy needs a wife to settle him down. Lady Cecilia's family has expressed interest. She would make a fine match." Edmund's heart sank at the mention of Lady Cecilia. Though beautiful, she was known throughout court for her sharp tongue and calculating nature. Even now, he could see her across the hall, preening under the attention his father's words had brought her. "Such delightful news," Lady Cecilia simpered to her companions. Though really, what else could one expect? A prince needs a proper lady, not some common drudge. Edmund watched as the ladies tittered behind their fans, their jewels glinting in the afternoon light. Yet instead of their practiced charm, he found himself remembering Anna's quiet strength. Where these women wielded false flattery, she had spoken simple truth. Their elegant poses seemed hollow compared to her dignified bearing in the face of mockery back in the village. Agnes was hanging laundry when the royal steward arrived. His fine horse and embroidered livery drew curious onlookers as he dismounted and cleared his throat importantly. "By order of His Majesty, King Richard," the steward announced, unrolling a scroll. "The woman known as Agnes is hereby summoned to serve in the palace kitchens, beginning 1 week hence." The gathered villagers burst into fresh gossip. Agnes stood frozen, the damp sheet still in her hands. She could feel the weight of her neighbors' stares, could already hear the whispers starting. The prince's kitchen wife. They would call her now. Later, alone in the cottage's tiny bedroom she shared with her sisters, Agnes finally let her tears fall. The summons felt like both punishment and test. To refuse would bring the king's displeasure upon her family, yet to accept meant facing daily humiliation at court. "Lord," she whispered, pressing her face into her thin pillow, "grant me strength to bear whatever comes." Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs as she struggled to accept this new trial, torn between her duty to obey the crown and her fear of what awaited her at the palace. The autumn wind bit through Anna's thin cloak as the ox cart rumbled along the muddy road toward the capital. 4 other new servants huddled beside her on the wooden planks, sharing a rough blanket against the morning chill. Their journey had begun 3 days ago, and Anna's bones ached from the constant jostling. Fields of harvested wheat stretched endlessly on either side, the stubble glinting with frost in the pale sunlight. Agnes closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Lord, be my strength," she whispered, clutching the small wooden cross hanging from her neck. The cart crested a hill, and gasps rose from her fellow travelers. There, sprawling across the valley below, stood the capital city. Its gray stone walls rose like mountains, towers piercing the clouds. Anne's heart trembled at the sight. "Make way!" Their driver shouted as they passed through the city gates. The streets teemed with life, merchants hawking wares, children chasing hoops, ladies in fine silks stepping daintily around puddles. Agnes tried not to stare, but everything overwhelmed her senses. The clatter of countless hooves, the mingled smells of spices and sewage, the press of more people than she'd ever seen. At last, they reached the palace gates. Anna's legs shook as she climbed down from the cart. A stern-faced housekeeper herded the new servants inside, thrusting bundles of coarse brown uniforms into their arms. "Change quickly," the woman ordered. "The kitchens need scrubbing before the evening meal." The uniform scratched against Anna's skin as she followed the others down winding stone stairs into the vast palace kitchens. Heat from massive hearths struck her face, while the clang of pots and shouts of cooks created a deafening din. "You there, big girl," the head cook's voice cut through the chaos. "These pots won't scrub themselves." Thus began Anna's new life. From dawn until midnight, she scrubbed endless mountains of copper pots and iron kettles until her hands cracked and bled. The head cook seemed to take particular delight in finding fault with her work. "Lazy girl," she would screech. "Think because you caught the prince's eye, you can slack off. Back to work." The other kitchen maids were no kinder. They whispered and giggled behind their hands when Agnes passed. "Did you hear?" one would say loudly. "The prince promised she'd bear him 5 sons by spring. 5 elephants, more like." Another would reply, sending them into fits of laughter. Agnes bore it all in silence, focusing on her prayers and her work. But her heart nearly stopped one morning as she carried a tray of fresh bread up the servants' stairs. There, turning the corner, stood Prince Edmund himself. His eyes widened in recognition, color flooding his cheeks. Agnes dropped into a deep curtsy, her arms trembling beneath the heavy tray. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Edmund stepped aside, letting her pass without a word. But something changed after that encounter. Agnes began noticing the prince. In places he had no reason to be, striding through the kitchen gardens, inspecting the pantries, lingering in the servants' corridors. Each time their eyes met, he looked away first. After 14 hours of endless labor, Anne's final task was cleaning the massive kitchen hearth. Every muscle screamed in protest as she dragged herself up the narrow stairs to the servants' chapel. The small stone room stood empty at this late hour, a single candle flickering before the altar. Agnes sank to her knees on the cold floor, her calloused hands clasped in prayer. "Lord, grant me strength," she murmured, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Help me bear this burden with grace." In the shadows of the doorway, unseen, Prince Edmund stood watching. The candlelight caught the tears on Annis's cheeks, and something in his chest tightened painfully. He remained there, silent and hidden, as her quiet prayers filled the darkness. The winter wind howled through the palace corridors as Edmund pulled the rough servant's cloak tighter around his shoulders. His heart hammered beneath the coarse wool as he descended the narrow stairs to the kitchens. Most of the servants had retired for the night, save for those tending the great hearths that never died. The scent of fresh bread guided him through the shadows. There she was, Agnes, kneading dough by candlelight, her strong hands working the mixture with practiced grace. The firelight caught the loose strands of hair that had escaped her cap, making them glow like copper threads. "I've returned from 08 Hunt," Edmund announced, deepening his voice. "Might I trouble you for some bread?" Agnes turned, flour dusting her apron. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized him despite his disguise, but she kept her composure. "The hunt must have been poor indeed, your highness, to bring you to the servants' kitchen." Edmund winced at her directness. "You know me, then?" "A cloak cannot hide what pride reveals, my lord." She continued kneading, her movements steady and sure. "I deserve that rebuke." He stepped closer to the hearth, drawn by both warmth and her presence. "I have thought often of my cruelty that day in the village." Annes's hands stilled in the dough. "God teaches that we must forgive those who wrong us, even princes." Her simple words struck him deeper than any courtier's elaborate speech. "You speak truth plainly, Agnes. I admire that." Over the next hour, they talked as equals, he of his struggles with duty, she of scripture and faith. Her quiet wisdom made him forget the difference in their stations. The pattern repeated over several nights. Edmund would slip away from elaborate court suppers to seek her company in the quiet kitchen. They spoke of many things, her younger siblings' antics, his favorite passages from Solomon's writings, the weight of expectations they both carried. During one evening, as Agnes shaped loaves for the next morning, Edmund finally voiced the apology that had lived in his heart. "I am truly sorry for my mockery that day. It showed the worst of my character." Annes's hands gentled on the dough. "Pride goes before destruction, my lord, but humility brings wisdom." "You teach me humility with every word," Edmund admitted. "I was raised to command, yet you show me what true nobility means." "We are all equal in God's eyes," she reminded him, though a slight blush colored her cheeks. The kitchen grew quieter as the hours passed, until only the crackling hearth broke the silence. Through the narrow window, Edmund could see snow beginning to fall, pure white against the darkness. "I should go," he said reluctantly, rising from his seat by the fire. But instead of leaving, he found himself moving closer to where Agnes stood. Her eyes met his, steady and clear as always. Without thinking, Edmund reached for her hand, flour-dusted and warm from her work. As their fingers touched, a spark seemed to pass between them, something profound and frightening in its intensity. Agnes drew back quickly, though her hand trembled. "Your Highness must not," she whispered. "The scandal would destroy us both." Edmund knew she spoke truth, yet his fingers still tingled where they had touched hers. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly. "God keep you safe, my lord," she replied, already turning back to her work. But he saw how her hand shook as she reached for more flour, and knew his own heart beat just as unsteadily as he climbed the stairs back to his world of silk and ceremony. The snow fell thicker now, muffling the palace sounds, but nothing could quiet the tumult in Edmund's mind. In the kitchen below, Agnes pressed her flour-covered hands to her burning cheeks, trying to forget the warmth of his touch, knowing she must forget, yet knowing she never would. Chamberlain Godfrey's aged ears pricked up one frosty morning as he passed the servants' washing area. Two maids were gossiping as they scrubbed linens, their voices carrying through the steam. That Agnes Blackwood, putting on airs with her scripture quoting, One sneered, wringing out a sheet. As if a name like Blackwood means anything these days. Godfrey stopped short, his wrinkled hand gripping his walking stick. Blackwood. The name stirred memories from decades past, when he had served as steward to a minor estate in the northern counties. He hurried to his chambers, joints protesting, and pulled out dusty record books. There, written in faded ink, the Blackwood family, minor gentry who had held prosperous lands until the loyalty wars 30 years ago. The grandfather had chosen, wrongly, backing the losing side and paid with everything. Godfrey remembered the proud man reduced to nothing, his young son, Inez's father, forced to learn trade work. The old chamberlain found Prince Edmund in the library that afternoon, pretending to study state papers while actually gazing toward the kitchens. Your Highness, Godfrey bowed carefully. I have discovered something about the kitchen maid Agnes that may interest you. Edmund's attention snapped to him. Speak freely, Chamberlain. Her grandfather was Sir Thomas Blackwood, who held the Northbrook estates until the crown stripped them for disloyalty. She comes from fallen gentry stock. Edmund's face lit up. So she's not entirely common. This changes everything. The blood of nobility, however diluted, still flows in her veins. Godfrey confirmed. That evening, Edmund rushed to tell Agnes as she worked alone in the kitchen. Your grandfather was a knight. You have gentle blood after all. Agnes straightened. From the hearth, her face flushed from the heat. And what of it, Your Highness? My worth lies not in ancient blood, but in honest work and faith in God. These hands may be rough from labor, but they serve with dignity. Edmund stepped back, chastened by her quiet pride. Forgive me, I meant no offense. Then seek my value, in who I am, not in who my grandfather was, she replied softly. The 12th night feast arrived in a swirl of candlelight and music. The great hall blazed with hundreds of tapers, evergreen boughs draped every arch, and nobles in their finest silks and velvets twirled to the musicians' melodies. Agnes stood with other servants along the wall, bearing a pitcher of wine. Her plain brown dress was clean and pressed, her cap neat upon her head. Edmund, watching her from his place at the high table, saw how she carried herself with the same quiet grace, whether serving or being served. Rising suddenly, he crossed the hall toward her. Whispers followed his path. And as his eyes widened as he approached and bowed, "Will you honor me with this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. The music faltered. Courtiers gasped. Agnes hesitated, then set down her pitcher and placed her work-roughened hand in his. "If it pleases your highness." Edmund led her to the center of the hall. As the musicians recovered and began playing, he guided her through the steps. Though Agnes had never learned court dances, she followed his lead with natural grace, her movements dignified and sure. The initial shocked whispers faded as the nobles watched. There was something compelling in the way she carried herself, something that transcended her simple dress and servant's cap. Even those who had come ready to mock fell silent. When the dance ended, Edmund walked her back to the servants' quarters, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Both of their hearts pounded from more than just a dance. In a shadowed alcove, they paused. Edmund turned to face her, his hand still holding hers. Agnes lifted her face, moonlight from a high window touching her features. They drew closer, breath mingling in the cold air. But sudden footsteps on the flagstones made them spring apart. Agnes disappeared quickly into the servants' passage, leaving Edmund alone with his racing heart and the memory of how close they had come to kissing. Morning sunlight streamed through the palace's towering windows, but its warmth could not pierce the icy tension in the great hall. King Richard stood before his assembled court, his face dark with fury. The gathered nobles shifted uneasily, watching their monarch's barely contained rage. "This mockery ends today," The king's voice boomed across the marble floor. "Let it be known that Prince Edmund, heir to our throne, is hereby betrothed to Lady Cecilia of House Pembroke." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Lady Cecilia, standing near the front in a gown of emerald silk, lifted her chin with triumphant pride. Her legendary beauty seemed to glow brighter with this victory. Golden hair caught in the morning light, perfect features arranged in modest pleasure. Queen Eleanor stepped forward, her gentle voice cutting through the murmurs. "My lord, perhaps we might discuss this matter privately." "There is nothing to discuss," the king interrupted. His hand slashed through the air in a cutting motion. "The betrothal contracts are drawn. The wedding will take place before spring's end." The queen's face paled, but she held her composure. "At least allow the girl a proper dismissal, with references for new employment. The servant leaves now." The king's words fell like stones. "Guards!" 2 palace guards stepped forward, there, armor clanking in the tense silence. They marched toward the servants' quarters, where Agnes had been gathering her few belongings, already aware her time was ending. In her small attic room, Agnes folded her spare apron with trembling hands. She had known this day would come, yet the reality still stabbed deep. The guard's heavy footsteps on the stairs made her stomach clench, but she held her head high as they entered. "Come with us," one ordered gruffly, though his eyes held a hint of sympathy. Agnes followed them through the palace corridors she had scrubbed so many times. Servants and nobles alike turned away as she passed, none daring to show her kindness under the king's decree. At the palace gates, a guard thrust a small purse into her hands. "Your wages," he muttered. "There's a cart leaving for the northern villages. Best you be on it." Inside the palace, Edmund sat rigid at the formal supper, celebrating his betrothal. Lady Cecilia sparkled beside him, her laugh tinkling like silver bells as she charmed the assembled nobles. But Edmund might as well have been carved from stone. "My prince," Cecilia murmured, touching his arm, "you've hardly touched your soup." Edmund stared at his bowl with hollow eyes. The rich aromas that normally would have tempted him now turned his stomach. He could barely force himself to respond. "Forgive me," he said mechanically. "I find myself without appetite this evening." Outside the city walls, Agnes huddled in the back of a merchant's cart as it jolted along the rutted road. Her few possessions were tied in a bundle beside her, and the purse of coins pressed against her hip like a brand of shame. Other travelers chattered around her, but she remained silent, lost in prayer. "Lord, grant me strength," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched the palace lights grow smaller behind her. The grand towers that had once seemed like a fairy tale now looked cold and forbidding in the gathering dusk. The cart hit another bump, and Agnes clutched her bundle tighter. Each mile taking her further from Edmund felt like a physical pain in her chest, but she would endure, as she had always done. Her fingers found her mother's worn prayer book in her pocket, and she clung to it like an anchor as the palace finally disappeared into the darkness behind her. Agnes hunched forward against the biting wind as her warm boots crunched through fresh snow. After 7 long days of travel, the familiar sight of her village brought little comfort. The winter morning cast long shadows across the empty market square, where, just months ago, Prince Edmund had first mocked her. "Look who's returned from our grand palace adventure," called out the baker's wife, her voice sharp with spite. "Our very own scullery bride." Agnes kept her eyes forward, clutching her thin shawl closer. The jeers followed her down the lane, but she walked with the same quiet dignity she had shown at court. Her family's cottage appeared ahead, smoke curling from its crooked chimney. Inside, her younger siblings swarmed around her with cries of joy. "Agnes, you're home." Little Mary clung to her skirts, while Thomas showed her the wooden soldiers he'd carved. Their thin faces and patched clothes told of harder times during her absence. "Did you really cook for the prince?" Sarah, the youngest, asked with wide eyes. Agnes managed to smile, though her heart ached. "I cooked for many at the palace, but now I'm here to take care of you." She unpacked her meager belongings, including the sewing needles she'd carefully wrapped in cloth. By nightfall, she was back at her old place by the hearth, stitching a merchant's torn cloak to earn a few coins. Meanwhile, in the gilded halls of the palace, Prince Edmund drifted like a ghost through his days. His chambers lay in disarray, plates of untouched food growing cold by his bed. When pages arrived with Lady Cecilia's perfumed letters, he waved them away without a word. "Your Grace," his valet pleaded one morning, "the hunting party awaits. Lady Cecilia herself will be riding today." "Tell them I am indisposed," Edmund muttered, staring out his window at the gray winter sky. The same window where he had once watched Agnes crossing the courtyard, her arms full of fresh bread, her quiet strength drawing him like a lodestone in. His private chambers, sleep eluded him. He paced the carpeted floors until dawn, haunted by memories of their conversations by the kitchen fire. Her words echoed in his mind. "My worth is not in blood, but in labor and faith." While noble ladies had simpered and flattered, Agnes had spoken truth, even to a prince. Back in the village, Agnes rose early each Sunday, wrapping herself and her siblings in whatever warmth they could find. They trudged through the snow, too, the small stone church where she had prayed all her life. The familiar scent of candle wax and old wood wrapped around her like a comfort. Though the noble family sat in their carved pews at the front, Agnes led her siblings to the rough benches at the back, among the other peasants. When the hymns began, she lifted her voice in quiet devotion, the same song she had sung in the palace's servant chapel. Her clear tones carried notes of both sorrow and hope. "She thinks she's too good for us now," whispered the miller's daughter. But Agnes kept singing, her faith unshaken by cruel words. As dawn broke over the palace that same morning, Prince Edmund strode purposefully toward the royal stables. His face was drawn from sleepless nights, but determination burned in his eyes. "Saddle my horse," he commanded the startled stable boy. "The fastest we have." The boy scrambled to obey, bringing forth Edmund's favorite mount, a proud black stallion. As he tightened the saddle straps, Edmund stood rigid, his mind already racing down the snow-covered roads ahead. He had endured enough. The endless balls, Cecilia's calculating smiles, his father's cold satisfaction at his apparent submission. But in his heart, Edmund knew there was only one path to peace. One road he must take, though it led away from everything he had known. The horse stamped impatiently in the pre-dawn chill, breath steaming in the air. Edmund swung himself into the saddle, his cloak whipping in the wind. Behind him, the palace slowly awakened, unaware that its prince was about to defy convention, duty, and the rigid bonds of class that had kept him from his heart's truth. Through bitter winter winds and treacherous roads glazed with ice, Prince Edmund urged his horse onward. For 2 long days, he rode with single-minded purpose, stopping only when his mount needed rest. His fine clothes grew travel-stained, his face chapped by the biting cold. Yet he pressed forward toward Anna's village. The clatter of hooves on frozen ground drew villagers from their homes as Edmund entered the square. Women peered from doorways, while men gathered in hushed clusters, pointing at the sight of the royal heir alone, without guards or ceremony. His horse's labored breathing created clouds of steam in the frigid air. Edmund's boots struck the ground with purpose as he dismounted. His legs were stiff from riding, but he stood tall, facing the growing crowd. Here, in this very square, he had once made his cruel jest. Now he would make amends before these same witnesses. "Good people," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. In this place, I once spoke words of mockery about Agnes, daughter of Thomas. I shamed her for sport, thinking myself above her." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I stand here now to declare before you all, I would rather live as a pauper with Agnes than rule as a prince with another." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman dropped her water bucket with a clang. Children who had been playing stopped to stare. The declaration spread like wildfire through the village, carried from lip to lip, house to house. The prince wants Agnes. He's choosing her over his crown. Did you hear? He'd rather be poor with her. Within days, swift messengers brought word to the palace. King Richard's fury shook the very foundations of the castle. In his private chambers, he hurled a golden goblet against the wall, wine spattering like blood. "Impossible," he roared. "My son and heir, throwing away his birthright for a kitchen maid? I'll see him disinherited first." Queen Eleanor stood calmly in the face of her husband's rage. Her own past gave her courage. She remembered well the whispers and scandals when she, a mere baron's daughter, had caught the then prince's eye. "My love," she said softly, laying a gentle hand on the king's arm, "remember how your own father raged against our match? Yet here we stand, 30 years later, having ruled wisely together." "That was different," the king protested, but with less heat. "You were at least of noble birth. And what is nobility?" Eleanor asked. "Is it not found in character as much as blood? This Agnes has shown more dignity under mockery than many high-born ladies I know." Meanwhile, in the humble cottage where Agnes lived with her siblings, Edmund stood before her, his heart pounding. The small room was warm from the hearth fire, filled with the honest scents of bread and herbs. Here was more true comfort than in all his palace chambers. Agnes stared at him in disbelief, her eyes filling with tears. She had been mending by candlelight when he entered, and the needle still trembled in her work-roughened hands. Edmund lowered himself to one knee on the packed earth floor, caring nothing for his fine clothes. Here was no practiced, courtly gesture, but the genuine humility of a man before the woman he loved. "Agnes," he said softly, taking her calloused hand in his, "I came here knowing I might lose everything, my title, my inheritance, my place at court, but I cannot lose you. Will you consent to be my wife?" Tears spilled down Agnes's cheeks as she looked at the man who had once mocked her, now kneeling at her feet. In his eyes she saw not the arrogant prince who had wounded her pride, but a soul transformed by love's power to humble and heal. The firelight flickered over them both as the moments stretched between them, heavy with the weight of choice, his choice to risk all for love, and hers to accept or refuse the hand that offered both sacrifice and devotion. Chapter 10. The Marriage of Hearts and Kingdom. Chapter 10. The wedding day dawn painted the palace chapel in hues of rose and gold as spring sunshine filtered through the stained glass windows. Hundreds of beeswax candles flickered in their holders, their warm light dancing across the faces of those gathered within. The air held the sweet scent of fresh flowers, humble daisies and wild roses gathered by village. Children mixed with exotic blooms from the royal gardens. Agnes stood before the altar in a simple gown of cream-colored wool, adorned only with delicate embroidery she had stitched herself. Her cheeks glowed with quiet joy, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Beside her, Prince Edmund appeared every inch a royal air in his formal attire, yet his expression held none of its former arrogance. Instead, his face shone with tender devotion as he gazed at his bride. The gathered crowd presented a sight never before witnessed in the chapel's long history. Noble ladies in silk gowns stood shoulder to shoulder with village women in their best homespun dresses. Lords and farmers alike bowed their heads as the priest began the ceremony, reading the banns for the third and final time. For the third time of asking, The priest's voice rang clear through the hushed chapel. If any person knows cause or just impediment why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. In the weighted silence that followed, King Richard sat rigid in his throne-like chair, his face a mask of barely contained displeasure. Yet beside him, Queen Eleanor beamed with maternal pride, her eyes glistening as she watched her son. When the moment for objection passed, she raised her hand in an unmistakable gesture of blessing. Edmund's voice carried strong and sure through the chapel as he spoke his vows. I, Edmund, take thee Agnes to be my wedded wife. His hands trembled slightly as he held hers, but his words rang with conviction. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. Agnes's response came soft but clear, her simple dignity touching even the most skeptical nobles. I, Agnes, take thee Edmund to be my wedded husband. Her voice grew stronger with each word, filling with quiet joy. No royal jewels adorned the bride, no crown graced her head. Yet as Edmund slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Agnes radiated a beauty that outshone any diamond. Their shared smile, as they turned to face the congregation, spoke of triumph sweeter than any military victory. The triumph of love over prejudice, of character over rank. The wedding feast that followed filled the great hall with unprecedented merriment. Servants and nobles shared tables, village musicians played alongside court musicians, and laughter flowed as freely as the wine. Queen Eleanor had arranged for dishes both humble and grand, hearty stews alongside delicate pastries, fresh bread beside exotic fruits. As the celebration reached its height, Prince Edmund rose from his seat, drawing all eyes. His face bright with mischief and joy, he raised his goblet toward his bride. My dear wife, he proclaimed, his voice carrying through the hall, with that body you shall birth me 5 sons by spring. For one breathless moment, silence fell. Then Agnes's clear laugh rang out, followed swiftly by Edmund's own. The entire hall erupted in merry understanding as the cruel jest of months past transformed into a declaration of love and hope. Even King Richard's stern expression softened slightly at the edges. Agnes leaned into her new husband's embrace, her heart too full for words. Around them, the celebration continued, but they seemed wrapped in their own quiet joy. Noble ladies, who had once whispered behind fans, now raised honest toasts to the bride's health. Village folk who had once echoed mockery now beamed with pride at their own Agnes, become a princess through no magic but the power of her own dignity and faith. The spring sunlight streamed through the high windows, touching all gathered there with its warm glow. In that golden moment, the rigid barriers between court and village seemed to soften and blur, transformed by the pure joy of 2 hearts joined as one. What had begun with cruel laughter in a village square had blossomed into a love story that would be told for generations. A tale of how true affection could bridge any divide and turn mockery into celebration. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks